You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. Today it's my pleasure to be in the good company of my friend Helen Pattison. But let me just tell you a little bit of story of how we got here. Helen and I have been friends for a long time, and if you've heard about our crazy walks, Helen was the first person to put her hand up and go, I'll join you on a crazy walk. So we've been friends, we've walked together, and Helen is now the chief exec of War Child. And when she got this new job, she posted on LinkedIn and said, I've got this job and we're here to develop the psychological safety of children in war zones. So you know me, I'm straight on WhatsApp to Helen going, you must come to the Coaching Inn and talk about it, because as we know, when we hear people talking about words we use in a different context, we can make our own meaning back into the space of coaching. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Claire. It's really wonderful to be with you. And I remember that walk so well. There were 6 of us, I think, at the start. Yeah. And then by the end, there were like 600 of us. So it was such a pleasure to be at the first one with you.
Yeah, you were. When I didn't think anyone would take John Gray up on his crazy idea of multiple people. So, Helen, tell us a bit about War Child and about your role, and then we'll dig into psychological safety.
No, for sure. So I'm the Chief Exec of War Child UK, as you said, Claire. So yeah, that means what it says. I lead the organisation, and I've been doing this role for about 4 months now. I've actually been at War Child for much longer, so for the last 5 years. And before that, I was leading their fundraising and communications function. And War Child, I mean, it's just my greatest privilege to lead it, really. I can't think of a charity that is more needed in the times that we're living in at the moment. When people will just be aware of conflicts that they see in the news, in places like Gaza, in Ukraine, places they'll have heard of as well, like Afghanistan and Yemen. And then also many places that are simply forgotten, places like Burundi, places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic. And so we are in the world's darkest, unquietest corners, often where the cameras aren't, and we are there for children, quite straightforwardly. And there's lots of services in the world that are available to help when conflict happens. But a lot of these services are around things like water, around shelter, around food, and these are vital. They're vital, and War Child does help with some of those, but we are much more in the realm of psychological safety. So what happens to the psychological first aid that a child needs when they've lived through the trauma of war? And very often, if you've got shelter, you've got a bed for the night, but time and time again, we see children that are wetting those beds because they're so traumatised by what they've experienced. They can't sleep, they're having nightmares because they can't process what's happened to them. And we all know, we know very well that we need that psychological safety. And that's just when we go through things in our lives that perhaps aren't easy or challenges, when you've lived through an active war zone. And when you're a child, children are uniquely vulnerable in war as well, because they have things that adults they don't have. So children need caregivers, they need their parents, they need an education so they can read and write. So they've got all these special circumstances that we've really got to work hard to protect.
Wow, what a gift.
And
what a task.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a big one, Claire, because there are more children living in conflict than there ever have been before. And that number, sadly, we think that's going to rise. We're projecting that will rise over things like resources, climate, internal conflict within countries. So I think that number is going to get bigger, and so the demand for our work is going to get higher. But at War Child we have a sort of, I guess, just a culture, a way of being, which is about what's possible and what we can do. And that's really part of our DNA. So we were formed 30 years ago by a couple of filmmakers. We were very much founded on the music industry, and we have a strong music heritage. And so the sort of the creative, the inspirational, what you can do has always been part of what we do. And I think that's so important. We spend a lot of our time actually putting on events, gigs, experiences that people can engage in, because actually at its heart of what we do is recovery and hope, restoring hope to children. And children have got a brilliant capacity, in my experience, to get better, to heal from trauma. And so I think there's something about celebrating that hope that we try and bring into the ethos of what we do in the UK as well.
Wow. So that's the UK end. Tell us a little bit about, what does the work look like on the ground? Because I'm sensing this is about safe enough or a little bit less unsafe than you were before. Psychological safety.
Yes, it looks like lots of different things, and I think that's what I love about War Child. So I think fundamental to what we do is understanding what actually makes a difference. So in our sort of NGO speak, we call that evidence-based interventions, EBIs. But what that means is we've got an amazing team of researchers who have looked at interventions that you might have heard of, seen on the TV. You might have seen a group of children, for example, playing with a ball in a group, and that can look very similar to what we do. But what we've done is researched what actually makes a difference in terms of the psychological recovery. And so we've done that through a control group, testing different interventions, and then looking at the long-term impact and outcomes for children, and then knowing which intervention was the most successful. So that's your evidence-based interventions. And so it can look like movement, communication, games, interactions, anything that can make a child feel like they can engage in something. It would be really common for a child that's traumatized to not be able to move, to not be able to speak. And so what we do is trying to unlock what's going on with that child. And without getting too technical on everybody this early in the morning, I'm not sure where you're broadcasting, but we in the mental health and psychosocial space, we have a triangle. And at the bottom, we have sort of very broad-based interventions, which are things like trying to get children to do perhaps art therapy or sports interventions. We've got an activity called Team Up. And that's great in itself, because for many children that works, and that they can actually learn to interact, to communicate, to trust adults, to be in a safe space, and that's enough for them. For children that have been through really difficult things, it's not enough. But actually them engaging with that kind of activity is a brilliant first step for us doing sort of more in-depth, going up the triangle. And we might be able to identify children that need a little bit more help, that might need some casework, some one-on-one, some referral to some services as well. So it could look like many, many different things. I was actually, 2 weeks ago, I was in the West Bank. So I was staying in Jerusalem, and I was seeing an amazing methodology called Be There. That's the name we gave it. And it's the parents, it's the caregivers. And it was really interesting for me as a mum, because I've actually done a few things like that, in Hitchin, in Letchworth, where I live. But it's a properly developed manual that mainly women, so mums and grandmas were in the session, come to. And it's about giving them coping techniques for looking after their children, because they're living in a war zone too. Effectively in the West Bank. We don't hear about that so much, but their lives are very, very difficult, very constrained. Movement is difficult, violence is ever present. And that's a really stressful environment to live in, to work in, to parent in. And we all know when our resources get depleted, we can take that out on those closest to us. And so this session was all about giving these women some coping mechanisms for how to parent their children better. And we know, it's well researched about the impact that has on children and their psychological safety when their parents feel safe and are able to give them that environment.
Oh. What do you mean by psychological safety, Helen? How do you define it at War Child?
I think that it's conditions in which a child can thrive and the child feels safe. It's safety is at its very heart, isn't it? And unpacking safety is tricky, but can a child be a child? Can a child play? Can a child run? Can a child interact with their siblings? Can a child go to school? I remember talking to one of my colleagues when the war in Ukraine 2 years ago was at its heaviest, and they had given some training to the teachers. Because what they were finding was the sirens were going off when the bombs were falling, which was the indication that you need to go down into the bomb shelter. And children were so traumatized by what was happening that they were having a classic response, which was the freeze response. Because we can do that kind of flight or flight. But the freeze is obviously really dangerous because they weren't going into the bomb shelter. They were just literally stuck. And the training we were giving to the teachers was like what to do when a child does that. And so how to get the child from where they are to actually move to the actual physical safety, the bomb shelter. And that example just stays with me because it just strikes me that actually psychological safety kind of comes before anything else. You would think it would be physical safety. But if your body and your mind can't get you to the bomb shelter, you're not going to be safe from anything. And so it's like, how do you unlock that you can have your normal responses, which is to run from danger when there's danger, to do what you need to do.
Wow, and I'm just, in my head, and I'm sure listeners in your heads, you're making connections between that and the workplace, because clearly workplaces there aren't bombs dropping.
Not literal bombs.
Metaphorical bombs. And there's a lot of freezing going on that you don't see.
Yes. And I think adults start to mask it, don't they? Or you learn coping mechanisms. And I think the wonderful thing in a way about being a child is that you haven't learned those things. So you don't have to unlearn anything in that sense. You can just respond to something that's going to be helpful to you. And I think that's why it's so incredible to work with children, to be honest, Claire, because you've just got that potential that's there. I'm not saying the work is easy, it's not easy, but I think I just find it so inspiring time and time again to see the potential of a child when they've been on a recovery journey.
You've described in lots of ways how small things can begin the journey of unlocking.
I think that's really powerful, actually, because, again, I can remember being in Ukraine and watching children drawing. And actually, you might have just looked over and thought there's a group of kids with some pencils, but they were actually with an art therapist. And the art therapist was just very gently talking to the children as they were drawing. And then when you look at what the children were drawing, they were drawing pictures of their homes, of what their homes used to look like, of their dreams, of their journeys, fleeing to safety from, where that had been. And that tells you so much, those little things, those little actions. And as adults, I'm rubbish at art, but we rarely sit down, do we, and think, oh, I'm going to spend some time, actually helping to process that event that's just happened through whatever mechanism, whether that's art or whether that's writing or reflecting. And we tend not to do that. We don't have those sort of mechanisms built in to our day-to-day, and I'm sure we should.
Yeah, because it keeps the flow, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than the blocker.
Yeah.
I met some guys the other day who were refugees from Syria, and they'd met in a camp and had ended up in the UK in similar places, and now are in different places, but are really great friends. And they were talking about different things that they'd done in the camps.
Right.
And for them, music was the thing.
I don't think that music has to be your thing for you to find music uplifting and helpful. So many of us stick on, whether it's the radio or the TV, and whether that's music or it's the news or what Love Island or whatever it is that makes you just feel better. There's actually just a thing, I'm sure, that stimulates us all, through the audio bit of our brain. And there's, I've done a music degree, actually. That was my original kind of roots before I went into the world of international development. And there's just so much power in music just to make people feel better. Certainly when I was in Jerusalem last week, there's an area called Silwan, which is right near the heart of the old city in Jerusalem, which is experiencing really, really difficult tension, unrest, violence, people having their homes destroyed. And in the heart of this sort of like neighborhood was a centre. It wasn't a particularly exciting, attractive centre at one level visually, but it had all of these activities for children to do, for somewhere to come, the heart of the community, and music was one of them. And it's just where you can kind of engage and take yourself to a different place. I feel like we're moving into the desert island discs territory here, but I think it's very powerful anyway.
Venture design, what would you take? What's really interesting is that these guys are in a choir, and the person who runs the choir gets them to bring their own tunes and make their own words.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
I mean, the time that I've spent with Syrian refugees has actually been mainly in the sort of refugee camps of Iraq and of Jordan. And I've just been amazed, actually, with just by the Syrian culture, particularly. Like Syrian people are really sort of skilled craftsmen. They're very artistic. They use their hands. They make things a lot. So there's a lot of creativity. Yeah, I mean, and the songs and music, that we carry from our own cultures that are really, really important to us, are foundational. I spent a lot of time in my music degree thinking about this, about the constructs of music. And actually, I sing nursery rhymes all the time at the moment to my own children. And when you look at the kind of constructs of how most nursery rhymes are made, it's sort of very similar patterns, which is all about the kind of construct that our cultures put onto music and how we hear music and how we resolve it and where we've seen that from. But when you have those sung to you by a caregiver from an age where you don't know words or you can't understand the words, you understand music. We bring children, don't we, with lullabies to understand music. So the power of recalling that, I imagine, for those people is incredible. And just reconnecting with, where they've come from and where they would ideally be as well.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking as we're talking, it connects you to your historical ancestral story, doesn't it? So you probably sing about the plague to your children.
Yeah, all of those lovely, lovely things. Plague, of death, of animals and all sorts of things. It's very weird, isn't it?
But they're things that you remember. So if you're not in the UK, there's an English nursery rhyme called Ring a Ring of Roses, a pocket full of posies. And it comes out from the Black Death in 1660 something. So hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it still retells the story, but there's something about reconnecting to your ancestral story that I really think is important, and they're the things you remember later on, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I think from my experience of just visiting relatives actually at the end of their life, and actually being surrounded by music and having those musical triggers is incredibly powerful as well. So, but I'm just thinking, Claire, I've done enough work with Syrian refugees to know something about the journey that those people have been on. And I think one of the most moving moments of my career, it wasn't with War Child, actually. I used to work for an amazing charity called Action Aid, and we were on the shores of Lesbos in 2016 when there was just a lot of traffic across the Mediterranean. So, it's great, isn't it, with work? You go to a Greek island, but it wasn't like that at all. It was terrifying. It was January and it was freezing cold. And we saw with our own eyes the dinghies arriving on the shores of Lesbos and what that meant. And it's an experience that will never leave me because it had the full range of human reaction, I think, physiological, psychological, as those boats arrived, there were people, vomiting, there were people praying, there were people crying, there were people that had fainted, there were people that were shouting, there were people that were singing because they were so relieved to have got there. And you just saw that literal humanitarian catastrophe unfold on that beach. And then it happened time and time and time and time again. And for us to really understand the journey that those people have been on in every sense, that journey, and what it must take to put your family and your very young children in one of those really flimsy dinghies to kind of come in search of safety, I think just shows such an incredible act of bravery and courage. And these things, are incredible. And actually, the people that you've met, we should celebrate where they've been and what they've been on. And I see it in my work with War Child as well. Of course, refugees, but actually, we talk less about internally displaced people as well. So in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC at the moment, there is a massive catastrophe unfolding through the violence from, armed groups, particularly in the area near Goma. If you read well, you might have seen a couple of column inches about it a couple of weeks ago. But there's 3 million people that have been kept displaced internally. So they haven't got refugee status, but they're nowhere near their home. And it's those kind of things that are happening. And this is a great opportunity to tell your listeners that it's happening and it's catastrophic and it shouldn't be happening, but it is. And that agencies like War Child are there. I think one of the bits of our work that I'm proudest of is the work that we do with reunifying children with their parents or with their caregivers. So, we sort of do that kind of identifying, tracing, reunifying. And children, you can imagine that are by themselves in the middle of that chaos. It's really, really hectic for them. And in Gaza at the moment, there are 17,000 of those children as well. So we have to continue. We have to keep going, So for everybody, listening, it's like there's loads of things actually that you can do for War Child. We've actually set up our own record label. That's one of them. So if you go onto Spotify, you can listen to some War Child music. And every time you stream that, that's just helping us to be present in those places and to help those children.
And I've got more things I want to talk about, but right now it seems an appropriate moment to say. So if people want to support War Child, because we can't go to Goma, or even if we're trained therapists, we're not the people to be there.
No.
So if we wanted to financially support you to send local people to be there who were trained and equipped, how would people financially support you, Helen?
So the very best way is our website. So it's www.warchild.org.uk. And there's different ways you can support on there. So you can give a gift if that moves you. The very best thing, if anybody asks me what can they do, is set up a monthly donation for whatever amount is appropriate for you. That just gives us the longevity to be able to know that we're going to be in Goma and Gaza and everywhere in between, today, tomorrow, next month, next year. That's what children really need, is that commitment, because it takes time to recover from things that have traumatized us. That is not an overnight thing. So if anyone feels moved to do that, I would be really grateful. That's warchild.org.uk.
Thank you. So the question that's been coming up for me is that your staff in the UK and your staff on the ground, your local staff on the ground, also need to be psychologically safe enough.
It's a lovely question, Claire, and it's so important. And I think probably listeners will be able to really imagine what that's like in Gaza at the moment, because we've got our partners on the ground, and we've got staff members on the ground in Gaza, because that's where they live. And they are also sheltering for their lives. They're also trying to keep their own families safe. They're trying to find food for their family as well. They are living in this active conflict, which has affected every single person in Gaza. You've just got over 2 million people, and there isn't someone that this conflict hasn't touched. 70% of the buildings in Gaza are destroyed. It's a humanitarian catastrophe like we've never seen before. So one of the very first things that we did, which sometimes doesn't sound that compelling, but I'm so proud of it, is basically a listening service for all of our trained psychotherapists and counsellors across Gaza, so that we are actually providing support for them. We're called Helping the Helpers. And so it's support that they can access, so that, in moments when they can, that they are therefore ready to respond, because they've done that thing that we all need to do in order to help, which is to have got ourselves in a position to help. It's like you fit your own oxygen mask first, don't you? And that seems weird in a time of crisis, but it's really important because otherwise you can't do that work. And so actually helping those people has been our absolute priority, and setting up listening services for them. So on the ground, we do pay a lot of attention to it as well, because it's just so important. And often these conflicts are so long term as well. They've been going on for years. And so you need to look after yourself. Look in that context. I was with my amazing colleague, Sahar, who leads all our work in Palestine 2 weeks ago. And every morning she gets up and she rings her colleague, who's leading our response in Gaza, to check that he and the team are still alive, that they're all okay, that our partners are okay. And that's their job every single morning. And so it really puts into quite acute context what my life looks like every morning. Because sometimes it feels like a battle enough to get to work when I've got 3 very young children, and all they need. But, when that's what I know Sahar does every single morning, you kind of think, wow. But you can't be paralysed by that. I have to be very clear about what my job is and what her job is. And her job is to lead that amazing team on the ground. And my job is to run the organisation really well, that is going to give excellent support to what they are doing. And so I have to make sure that I'm okay and my team are okay as well, because we all have to do our jobs right. And I love the ecosystem of people that do different things in the world and how we make the world work for better, and understanding what it is that I can do, excuse me, is really important. And I think that, this safety idea is at its most kind of pointed with my colleagues in the communication team, because they are seeing things all the time. They're scrolling, they spend their time on social media, reading through our stuff, reading through other people's stuff, and some of it's deeply distressing. I don't expect there isn't a listener that you have, Claire, that isn't thinking at times in the last 6 months, I've just turned the news off or I've put my phone down, because so you should. It is too much for us all, and we all need to know when to take those breaks. And sometimes the comms team don't get that, and we've realised that actually in the last 6 months, that we need to work with them to help, with what they have to deal with on a regular basis. And, that some of it's really sad. Not many people will know this, but there was a series of earthquakes in Afghanistan on October the 7th. And of course, on October the 7th of last year, our attention was in many ways rightly diverted elsewhere. Yes. But those earthquakes were devastating in Afghanistan. We were responding really quickly. Our Afghanistan team was doing an amazing job, actually, and I'm so sad for them, because they were just on it so quickly. They just got and drove out to where the earthquake had been, very close to our office, actually, and we're just distributing water, setting up safe spaces for children. And it hardly got enough coverage from our end, never mind the world's end, because of what happened. But, really sadly, we had a load of photos that got sent through, and really sadly, there was a photo in there of a child that had died. And sometimes it's people's job to go through those photos and go, of course, no, we'd never publish that on our channels. But then you have to look after the people that are seeing those photos as well. So it's not the same as living in active conflict by any means, but it is our reality. And so keeping people safe. I spend a lot of my time thinking about that and looking after my staff, thinking about our culture, how we provide an environment where people can feel safe. I think it's become a bit cliched now, but I'm still passionate about it, is, how can you bring your whole self to work if that's what you want to do? As much of yourself as you want to be able to, you should be able to bring that to work. And it should feel safe when you've done that. And I don't think we are there yet, but I would love to hope that anybody that from Warchild that was listening would say that we're pointing in the right direction, that we're listening, we're understanding what it is that would make people feel safe. There's a really interesting Stonewall survey, actually, that we've just completed. Stonewall, an amazing organisation, supporting the rights of LGBTQIA+ people. And that survey is really quite enlightening, because it just helps you to check out as a workplace how you are doing, and just dismantling discrimination, and dismantling all of the biases that we have. And as I was sort of reflecting with some colleagues, if you're non-binary and you're in our office, you need to go to the toilet several times a day, like we all do. And if you haven't got gender neutral toilets, that is a triggering thing all the time. So, there's a lot of things that I think, when you're trying to plug yourself into how to make people safe and to be able to do their best, that's really challenging as well. How do you deconstruct all of that and make it happen? And so we're trying.
And awareness is step one, isn't it?
Yeah, awareness. And then I think empathy as well. It's hard, isn't it? Because it's really easy to empathise with. Well, empathy is about something that you've been through and you can relate to, and we're all a product of our individual experiences. But my lived experience is one of privilege, predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly, and recognizing that privilege, like you say, with awareness, is one of the best things that I can do in terms of trying to understand that someone else's lived experience is entirely different to mine.
Well, what a privilege, Helen. Catch up with you.
No, it's lovely to chat, Claire. It's really making me think, as we've just been talking about, the world that you inhabit and your listeners inhabit, and I guess how, as coaches and networker coaches, you're having those conversations all the time. I've actually been really privileged enough to have a coach, somebody that I used to work with who was training as an executive coach, came up to me and said, I'd really like to offer to help you in your new role. And yes, I've just been blown away by how helpful that has been.
Amazing.
In support. So yeah, and I wish you and your listeners and all the important work that you're doing. Like I say, it's these support structures, and you're providing that support to the structures that are doing amazing work around the world. So lots to celebrate.
And we need to do our own safety as well. And I think the thing that's really underlined the kind of the takeaway organisationally outside of the war space that I'm taking away from what you're saying is what a difference it's making in your organisation when you're paying attention to the safety of your staff.
Yeah, absolutely.
In work time.
Yeah, 100%.
Wow. Thank you, Helen Pattison.
Thank you so much, Claire.
And if you want to make a donation to War Child, because we never ask you for anything, right? So this is a great opportunity to give everybody. It's www.warchild.org.uk. Thank you for listening. Helen, thank you for coming to the Coaching In. Bye-bye, everyone.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching In, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching In, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.